morning. Today we're releasing the 2018-2019 budget. It's a solid budget. It's one that takes account of the needs of the state and also prepares for the future. The key to this budget is the fact that California has a very volatile tax system, and it means that money comes in very generously, very buoyantly, but it goes out the same way. And we have to take account of the basic reality of our economic business cycle. And that is, we've had 10 recessions since World War II, and we have to get ready for the 11th. This is a message that I've given year after year, and fortunately we haven't hit that recession yet, but we will. And that's why it's so important that we prepare for that recession, not when it comes, but years before. And the only way you can prepare is to watch your spending each year and to build up the rainy day fund. So the key part of this budget is to fully fund the rainy day fund that the legislature unanimously voted for and the people of California voted for by a 70% vote. In addition to the rainy day fund being full and being ready for the next recession, and by the way, in that respect, remember, it was just a few years ago that 30,000 teachers lost their jobs. They were laid off. And that will happen again if this rainy day fund is not fully available for the downturn. Because the downturn means, if it's just a normal recession, $20 billion a year for 3 years. That's a pretty good estimate. It's a little less than that, a little more. The rainy day fund can give the new administration time to manage. Second thing, we're fully funding the local control funding formula, which puts out money taking into account the needs of low-income families, families that don't speak English at home, and foster care kids. So schools have reaped an enormous revenue gain from the recession. And another thing I would highlight in the budget, we also are funding an online community college that is targeted at people who are in the workforce and they need to upgrade their skills and get an opportunity to improve their lives. They can't often take off from their job, but by having a fully available online 2-year community course with all the various courses and certificates that would make available would really help people very much. So I will mention our nice charts here. As you see, we're right here, and at the end of the budget year, the California recovery will be equal to the longest recovery ever since World War II. So that means that anytime between now and then or after that, we have to be on our guard. It's not exciting, it's not funding good and nice things, but it's getting ready, and that is the work of the budget. Again, over on the right, you've seen this chart. We've increased it a little bit. I think the real point here is you get a few years of surplus, but you get many years of deficit, and the deficit, cumulative, is far more than any of the surpluses. So that's the world we live in. And because we live in that world, we've got to be prepared. So we have our piggy bank, which is the rainy day fund, and you can tell we're right here and we want to fill it up. So we have that piggy bank waiting for the next governor, and when the recession happens, he or she will be able to spend that money and get ready with various maneuvers that the finance department can use and invent and get through that recession with a minimum amount of pain. Remember the last time, cut the university, tuition went up. Cut child care slots and reduce the funding for schools to the point that 30,000 teachers lost their jobs. The whole point is to think ahead and minimize the pain that is coming because of the way our business cycle works. That's just the way it works. Anybody, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
Governor, this budget does doesn't, as you mentioned in the summary, it doesn't touch on changes in the federal tax law.
Yes.
Because we don't know what's going on. But also this morning, there's a Senate hearing on a proposal by Kevin De Leon that would do this charitable contribution workaround. Do you have thoughts on that type of proposal? Is it something that you're open to?
Yes, I'm certainly open to it. It looks interesting. But the two questions: can it work? And if it does work, can the Internal Revenue Service issue a regulation and completely subvert it? So those are two questions that I hope the hearing will address.
Governor, your budget calls for a new allocation for community colleges and specifically online community colleges.
Yes.
Can you just expand on why that's important, and is that a new
Well, it's important because there are people that are 25, 30, 35, or even older that are in the workforce that just have a high school degree, don't have the skills that they really need to improve their income, improve their job prospects. So this is targeted to several million people who could upgrade their skills by taking online courses and maintaining their employment, which they certainly need. So that's the idea of it.
Governor, you put an extra $3.5 billion into the rainy day fund over and above the usual. The Democrats in the Assembly particularly have said they want additional spending on social programs, health programs, and whatnot. You seem to be saying, no, put it in the bank rather than spend it.
Hey, I thought you retired.
I'm waiting for you to retire.
Well, I think the Assembly has called for the rainy day fund. They recognize that. Secondly, what we can talk about spending now and cutting later, or filling the reserves and continuing our spending right along. So this is about steady as you go, or exuberance followed by regret and pain. So that's what this is. This is a prudent budget, and we know how it works. And there it is. Those are recoveries. And the recoveries only last so long. I know around 2000 people talked about the new economy because of the internet. That was during the administration of Gray Davis. Then you saw what happened. And lo and behold, a few years later, Arnold ran into the same problem. And one thing governors don't like is to be presiding over a hemorrhaging budget, because people do blame them. And for that reason, if none other, we're going to keep this steady
Governor,
as we go.
I wonder, based on your concern about recessions coming, what you make of the exuberance out of the president in Washington, who's been tweeting about 25,000 on the stock market and jobs coming back, and sees a different picture over the course of the next few years than you're laying out.
Well, we can have exuberance. I'm not saying we can't. We get a little cocaine injection of a couple $100 billion a year. That might I have no idea what that's going to do. It might stimulate some jobs. A lot of that, it is rather odd, though, that the America First is borrowing money from China and other foreign countries in order to pay the corporate tax break, because that money comes from somewhere. It's not coming from the American taxpayer. It's coming from foreign lenders. But number two, it might go for a year or two. But what's a year or two? You still then have to recover, and we can't turn on a dime. When the recession hits, as it did under, when we look at these lines here, when you see that red showing up, what do? Now, if they'd had a rainy day fund, they would have been much better off. So this will soften the blow, and if we get a lot more money, well, then there'll be a lot more to spend next year. But we are in a stop and go, up and down kind of thing. When we had the property tax before Prop 13, it was very steady, particularly for schools and local government. When we went to the income tax, we have a situation where 70% of the general fund comes from the income tax, and half the income tax comes from the top 1%. And now with the Trump assault on the deductibility, the removal of that, who knows what that'll be. There's a lot of uncertainty out there, and you might get a lot of exuberance, but you still may get problems in California, so this is just a cautious approach.
Because of that exuberance, and you don't know where the taxes are going, you've seen a lot of budgets, you've seen a lot of administrations in D.C., whether it's taxes or immigration or in the environment, the situation in many Californians feels like it is war with Washington, D.C. Have you ever seen the enmity between California and D.C. like it is today?
Well, I wouldn't call it enmity. There are certain policies that are radical departures from the norm, and California will fight those, whether it's on immigration or offshore drilling and other things like that. But in general, I mean, the Californians are going about their business. The District of Columbia has their activities. I must say, just yesterday, Trump was talking about immigration, sounding rather different. So we don't know what will happen. I wouldn't want to portray a California-Washington battle, although there are some key differences, and we'll espouse our values. We're going to have an election in 2018, and I'm hoping that will steady the ship of state in Washington and return us to a more generous public sector.
Governor, on the issue of
what?
About the initiative to repeal
The what?
How concerned are you about the ballot initiative to repeal the gas tax?
Well, it hasn't qualified yet. Secondly, there'll be a very strong opposition to it. And thirdly, if it does pass, it'll be a decade at least before anyone thinks of providing the necessary money for roads and bridges. So it'll be if it were to pass, it would be a blow to California's economy. I think there's a very good chance it can be beaten. Because it's a common sense thing. This is all money going to roads, it's real, or to local transportation. So I think there's a good chance to beat it.
Given the decision on Florida yesterday on offshore drilling, do you believe that blue states are being targeted by the administration? And if so, what could
Are
you
you
do
referring
about
to the
it?
offshore drilling exemption?
Yes.
Well, we're certainly going to ask for that here. And we'll see how that, I'm hoping they'll be responsive. The Trump administration has been responsive on disasters, and now we see they've set the precedent in Florida, and we'll try to get the same exemption for California on offshore drilling. Yes.
Governor, there's about $4.5 billion in new transportation funding in addition to the SD1 funds. Can you talk about what that is and where it's going?
Where the planning?
That's the SD1.
Okay, that is all SD1 funds.
Yeah.
Okay.
On education funding, you're trying to achieve full funding 2 years ahead of schedule.
Yeah.
It's very much like you're still standing by LCFF, but this is happening in the face of flat test scores, persistent achievement gap, and federal scrutiny now. I wonder how do you defend putting so much money?
Do you want to starve the schools because they are challenging, and the people who are in the most difficult circumstances with the least income? I think taking money away from them just adds insult to injury and furthers their burden. Education is a local matter. Before Proposition 13, no one even thought the state had a big role, and it's still a local matter as far as I'm concerned. The way to improve scores is for teachers to work as effectively as they can and get the support of the rest of the school and the principal and the school board. This is a local matter. Only thing the state can do from here on out is add regulations, add administrative positions to monitor the flows of money and creating new kinds of administrative burdens. So this is not going to be solved in Sacramento. Kids learn at home or in the classroom. When that door shuts, there's no legislator, there's no governor. So we ought to, people who want to really help, and you have a school that's not performing, go to that school. Go talk to the principal. Find out what they need. But it's going to be basically a bottom-up kind of thing. That's where it is, and that's the philosophy that I want to promote, that we're looking in the wrong place when you look at Sacramento. We've done our part. We've got the money. We have the accountability, so you can read the reports and the local control accountability plans, and then you can show up. Local empowerment. That's what it's all about. We elect school boards. We live locally, and that's where the problem has to be solved, even though everybody wants to come to Sacramento, and then when they come here, they want to go back to Congress and pass a lot of rules. I think the age of micromanagement from Washington or Sacramento in the world of education is over, as far as I'm concerned.
Governor, could you talk a little bit about the effect on Californians of this cap on
state and local tax deductions if there's no workaround?
Well, they're going to make people who have higher incomes pay a lot more money, so some of them may be tempted to leave, and that's something that people are going to have to look at very carefully, because it does make our very progressive tax system more burdensome than it need be. And I think that was the point. This was an assault by the Republicans, really the Republicans in Congress, against California and New York and New Jersey and Maryland and Illinois and Massachusetts. That's not a good thing. America is very divided. The Republicans are divided, the Democrats are divided, and we still live in a very dangerous world. So it's really a dumb move on the part of the Republicans, and I'm hopeful that the next Congress will be Democratic and they'll reverse that.
Governor, on the issue of education, your budget calls for more money for both UC and CSU. But in talking to some of the advocates out here, CSU is saying, hey, that's good, but it's still not enough. What would be your response to that?
It is enough. You're getting 3% more, and that's it. They're not going to get any more.
What do you tell Californians?
And they got to manage. I think they need a little more scrutiny over how they're spending things. It's just because the university is a good, they say we've got to have more good. But if you have too much good, in certain circumstances, it becomes a bad. So they're going to have to live within their means. And what will happen here is the next recession, they'll have to put everything in reverse, lay people off, raise tuition, and that's not a good thing. So they got to lower the cost structure, and there are tools to do that, and they need to step up and more creatively engage in the process of making education reasonable and affordable.
What do you tell Californians, or your message to them, because I'm sure you have heard it, what's your message to Californians who feel like that it is war between California and the Trump administration, that somehow
well, I
America?
I don't try to emphasize the conflict myself, except when we have a particular issue.
What is your message to them? Is it?
Now, the Republicans, who knows? They're a temporary majority. Their members are leaving in discouragement. So there's always an opportunity to get a more conciliatory Congress. So that's where I put my attention. California has a lot of strengths, as do many of these other states. I think the point, even though from the journalist's point of view, conflict is good because conflict is news. The problem is too much conflict in America does not allow us to solve our problems, earn the respect of other people throughout the world, or defend ourselves. And I do think that the imperative here is to forge greater unity in the country as well as right here in California. That's why I've worked with the Republicans, even though they are a minority in the legislature, and I would say the same thing needs to be done at the national level.
Governor,
As you begin the final year of your governorship,
Yes.
could you please reflect on how things have changed or not since you first held the job more than 40 years ago? Is the job of governor any different now than it was then?
Well, there's a lot more money circulating around. The difference is with the passage of Proposition 13 and the insertion of the state government into local funding and local decision-making has radically changed the nature of California government. So it's put the legislature way in into the local process, and that creates some of the issues you've seen. Secondly, there's a lot more partisanship. There's a lot more knee-jerk one way or the other, and not as much of the collaboration. There was a time when the Senate picked their leader on a bipartisan basis. Democrats could vote for Republicans and vice versa. I think we need more of that in the coming years.
But in terms of the issues that a governor has to tackle, are they basically the same all these decades
Well, I mean,
later,
we
or
used to,
different?
in 1975, the prison budget was less than 3%. This year it'll be 9%. We had 12 prisons, now we have 33 and a medical facility. We used to have 25,000 people in prison, and now we have 130,000. So, yeah, there's more people incarcerated, there's more state intervention, more regulatory activity, and more partisanship. So, yeah, in some ways it's harder to manage, but in others, the governor does have more, I think, more impact because of just the way things have changed.
Along those same lines, if you could, this is your 8th budget in this return to being governor. You worked to shore up parts of the system, the rainy day fund obviously being one of them. where are the places, where are the pressure points, the danger points for the next person? I mean, what will you advise the next person? Where are the parts of the budget process that you think are
Well, the next person
beyond the recession?
is taking over right here. So he's on the next governor is going to be on the cliff. And that big red line, that's what I've had. What's out there is darkness, uncertainty, decline, and recession. So good luck, baby.
That has a remarkably dystopian view.
Well, but it'll be temporary. There'll be recovery. If they get through that 4 years and get reelected, things will look good in the second term.
But if I can just follow, Governor, aside from the gloominess, though, I mean, are there parts? I mean, obviously, healthcare is an issue, pensions are an issue.
Huge.
What would you put on that list?
Well, the pensions, depending upon how the courts rule, and I have a hunch they're going to modify the California rule, that when the next recession comes around, governors will have the option of considering pension cutbacks for the first time in first time in a long time, first time ever, I guess. So, what was it? Do you have another point?
No, just.
I'll go with that question. It appears that funding for the Natural Resources Department is down a bit. You know, given the fires, the mudslides, all the natural disasters we've had, how do you justify that? Do you think we need to put
I'm going to let Cohen explain that. Michael, you're going to get up here. You'll be able to explain that. I'm sure it's not. Look, we're going to put more money into disasters. By the way, that's another reason, another difference. We have a lot more disasters. We've got climate change. We weren't facing that before. These disasters, $800 million. We got a lot. It's going to be. It may keep going. So yeah, we need more money in that area. And I'll let Cohen go over what the cut was. It's probably There's a good explanation, I'm sure. All right.
Is there something or some set of things that you wish you could have fixed budget-wise that didn't get fixed budget-wise? More on pensions, more on health care costs? I mean, I don't know what it might be.
No, well, I wouldn't offer any suggestions. Look, there's many ways to do things, and life is not perfect. So, yeah, we could go back and rethink things, but what we did is what we could do and what we were able to get accomplished. So I don't know what counterfactual story you might want me to indulge in. Want to be, would it be, could it be, but I don't know that helps anything. What?
Would you tackle Prop 13?
And tackle in what sense?
Split roll any sort of the proposals that have been floating out there?
Well, look, the fact is there's more property taxes collected than ever. Because of the turnover in the property, there's more revenue. Government has a lot more revenue. If they want to find ways of lowering the threshold for new taxes, that certainly people can do that, but it takes a ballot measure. It's a little late for that now.
Governor, you pointed out, looking at that chart, that you've had the benefit of a recovery your entire stint in office. You also had the benefit of Prop 25, the majority vote budget.
Yeah, that made it easier.
Yeah, I wonder, whether you consider yourself almost a little lucky that you've had those two tailwinds.
Yeah.
Along with the tax increases that the voters gave you.
Yes. Now, I want to say, following that question, what's different? Back in 1975, well, since that time, we had those, but we didn't quite think in the same way of this up and down, up and down. We didn't think a recession comes, oh my God, a recession, let's deal with it. Now it's pretty clear that we're in a very cyclical world. That's number one. Number two, because of the income tax, the capital gains, we've made the tax system very volatile, very changeable. So those are two, it was much steadier. And in the local government through property tax, things worked in a way that was more stable. But if we have a rainy day fund, and if people don't move out of the state who have a lot of money, things will be okay. If they aren't, then they'll find some modifications.
So to follow on that, you don't like the L word, legacy, so I won't ask you about
The L word?
Yeah.
Legacy.
Yeah.
But because, can you tell me the legacy of Goodwin Knight? or Governor Merriam? Or Duke Majan? Governors don't have legacies. That's my number one proposition.
They weren't governor for 4 terms.
Right. Well, I might break the record, but I'm not ready to announce it yet.
But given that, your budget narrative and your remarks today, you make a big point of looking back at 2011 and talking about where we were then and where we are now.
Yeah, we had a $27 billion budget and a $30 billion wall of debt. Now we have a $8 billion, $10 billion surplus or more, and we've paid down that wall of debt considerably. So what's your question?
I was kind of getting to that. So, I mean, how you seem to really be saying it's vital that your successor keeps it that way. But at the same time, you've got all these tailwinds, and this is what you've been able to do. You haven't gotten to do maybe some of the...
Look, we have a whole political system that judges our executives by the state of the economy, over which they have virtually no impact. So you figure.
Governor, you mentioned that the state has the most money that it's ever had. Why do we also have the sharpest income inequality, and what does the state need to do to address it still?
Well, we've done a lot. We've done the local control formula, put more money in areas where there are more low-income families. We have the earned income tax credit. We raised the minimum wage way above the national average. We're spending $11 billion on income supportive services. If you look at our budget to help people who are low income and distressed, California is 2 or 3 times doing its share compared to other states. So we're doing a lot. But the capitalist economy globally, whether it's in China, Russia, England, or California, is generating inequality. And the paradox, of course, is that conservatives leaders are being chosen to preside over all that. So I don't know what you can say about it. I think California has a lot of opportunity. That's why people are here. But I think the idea that you can totally change that, that's a national, almost international phenomenon that is very worthy of consideration and action. But I think we're doing about as much as we should, and if anybody has any more ideas, we'll take them up. But the engine of global capital is so powerful that we're relatively modest in the responses we can make.
Governor, there are several proposals in the legislature regarding health care, single payer, expanding Medi-Cal to cover the undocumented. Those might come up in budget negotiations.
They might.
What are your thoughts on those?
Well, some of them are rather expensive. Others are not quite baked and ready for action. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said. We're spending almost $100 billion on Medi-Cal. That's a lot of money. We've increased the number of people covered by Medi-Cal, I think, from about 8 million to over 12 million. Plus, we have over 1 million on the health exchanges. We've done a lot. We've dramatically reduced the number of uninsured. Now, we can go beyond that, but I think we have to move with caution, and I think there's going to be a lot of debate about that, and the path forward will not be as easy as what we've done up to date. And we also don't know exactly what the healthcare world is going to look like with the Republicans trying to cut back subsidies that are important for the Obamacare and other things that are being done in Washington. So I'd say it's a time for caution, but we always have room for inquiry and debate about ways to make it better.
Who do you think should be the next governor of California?
I'm not prepared to offer that.
Governor Brown, does this budget include the calculation of the possibility for the removal of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of immigrants because of the federal administration, including DACA students and whatnot?
Well, I don't think those are going to be removed. Some of the ones from Central America, their exit time is supposed to be in 2019. I'm very hopeful that we'll get a new Congress in 2018 and we'll reverse course. The fact is that people have come to America, they've come to California. The vast majority are contributing positively. They're part of the fabric. They're like all the other immigrants that have come, and like most of our forebears, in fact, all the non-native people have had immigration as the occasion for their being here. So I think there's a lot of positive, and I think we ought to build on that and not try to tear up what is a very good system.
In the past, there's been, certain funds allocated for the immigrant community. Is this going to be the case this year as well?
Well, we have $48 million in the budget to help support immigrants, and I think that is important. I do think just breaking up families like that is callous. It's very insensitive, and I can't believe that it will really be carried through. There's a strong group that calls for it, but I think the majority of Californians and Americans are more sympathetic to people who've done well and have contributed during their stay in America.
And as you know, Governor, the director of ICE has said California should watch out after you signed SB 54 about raids, immigration raids in the state.
Well, we'll wait. They've already been doing immigration raids, but he doesn't understand the SB 54. The federal government, in their zone of jurisdiction, could do, can do, and will do whatever they need to. And the California law only affects California personnel. So the two can work together, and hopefully this guy will not be some kind of, character going out raiding, scaring the hell out of people and interfering with farms and businesses and disrupting lives. I think that's not what America needs at this point in time.
About the surplus,
What
would you say to people who say that some of this money should be returned to taxpayers?
Well, then the problem with that is you return it, and then you got to cut and lay off teachers and raise tuition at the university because you're going to run out of money in a couple of years. So I'd say the nature of our financial framework, the way we collect taxes, requires large surpluses. 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you didn't need it, but you do now. So that's just the way it is. If you want to budget responsibly, you need big surpluses in the years that are good.
How's the search for a new Supreme Court justice going?
It's going very well.
You expect to have an announcement soon.
So I'm searching my mind
Yes?
very
Anything
carefully.
coming up?
This is not something that I want to do too quickly because I really want... Because it's very important now. I've appointed 3. The 4th could be very decisive. So I want to understand how that decisiveness should work.
The folks that are running to succeed you have talked about doing universal preschool, single-payer health care, even more money for affordable housing. As you look at your budget this year, can you imagine or talk about where that money might come from?
Yeah, taxes. A lot of those things require a ballot measure. Just put it on the ballot and tell people, we got a gas tax, and now we add one more. We'll have more of this tax, more of that. You can do it if you get more revenue. But the accumulated demand or desire for very good, worthwhile programs is greater than the revenue structure. So there's only one answer to that, and that is go back to the people and say, would you like to provide more? And I haven't heard that yet, but so they'll either have to do that or change course a bit.
Governor, how much of your budget is, in terms of revenue projections, maybe is depending on legalized weed this year, and if so...
Not much. Are
you concerned at all about the federal government's new stance on...
Yeah, but a lot of this federal government stance, they say one thing and they do another. So let's see what's going to happen. The U.S. attorneys live in California. They're from here. They know the temper of the times and the mood of people, and I think they'll be more restrained in carrying out Jeff Sessions' kind of obsession with marijuana.
Is it too soon to talk about a sanctuary state for marijuana?
No. First of all, we don't have a sanctuary state. We have a golden state. And we have a lot of these names thrown around. We'll look, the federal government can do a heck of a lot. If they want to pass a bill under the Supremacy Clause, they can do quite a lot. So we are dependent on that. But as you saw in the health care failure, they can't do everything. And given the fact that there is a new election, you got Republicans quitting in Orange County for probably, I don't think it's just because they thought they might not win or they had a hard campaign. I think they're a little disgusted with what's going on in Washington. So I think we have a lot of creative opportunity to make things better at the 2018 election. All right?
Can you talk about what California can do if...
Speak up a little louder.
Can you talk about what California can do if the CHIP program isn't funded?
To the what program?
The CHIP program isn't funded past March?
I don't know. I think we can just do our best to make sure it'll be funded, and there are a lot of states and a lot of powerful political leaders who want to see it funded. So I believe it will be funded. It has always had Republican support, so I don't see any reason why they're going to let it fail. All right? What?
Unrelated to the budget, obviously an issue that has been gripping Sacramento in the past couple of months is sexual harassment.
Yeah.
We've seen a number of lawmakers resign. What do you make of what's been going on? Does the Capitol have a problem, and how do you think leadership should be addressed?
Well, obviously there's a problem, and they are taking some action to deal with it. And I hope they come up with some standards and some procedures that will protect women's rights and create due process and make the whole process work better. And I think they will.
We've got Michael Cohen on deck here.
Okay, Michael Cohen.
Hey, Governor, before you leave.
Well, I believe you guys have said that now.
You cracked open this comment a moment ago. You said the California rule could be cracked open in courts, the pension rule. Why do you think that?
Well, because there's a case pending in the Supreme Court.
But can you give me, as a lawyer, as an attorney, as a former attorney general, why do you think it's a good case? The case will win.
Because the circumstances that first established the California rule are very different than the circumstances today. And there's already been several lower court opinions through the Court of Appeals with judges, both liberal and conservative, who have taken the position that employees are entitled to a reasonable pension, but not entitled to any remuneration that they can imagine. So I think that there's a rule of reason, and based on the idea that the pension system must be maintained, its integrity must be preserved, that there is more flexibility than is currently assumed by those who discuss the California rule. But like many things in the law, the so-called California rule is not as clear as you might think. And if you read the briefs that have been filed, there is a range of possible interpretation. I think where that's going to lead, when the Supreme Court looks at it, will be to greater flexibility. So at the next downturn, when things look pretty dire, that will be one of the items on the chopping block. Okay?
Thank you.
Let me start by clearing up the question on natural resources funding, and then I'll go over the overall numbers. The natural resources budget it's largely based on a display because of the disasters we're having in the current year. So the Cal Fire was within natural resources. Their emergency fund, the E-Fund, is $896 million in the current year, and we've budgeted $443 million for the upcoming year. So assuming we have a more typical fire year in the upcoming year, they certainly won't need that close to $900 million again. But if they do, obviously we're always ready to fund fire response, and that's why the E-Fund is there and gives us flexibility to do so. So let me switch back to the overall budget numbers. Sometimes you guys like these numbers. General fund budget overall is $131.7 billion. That's an increase of 4.1% from the current year. The total budget is $190 billion. That's increasing just less than 1%, 0.9% from the current year. We're projecting $106 billion in federal funds. Medi-Cal is almost 2/3 of that total. In terms of our general fund revenue forecast, our expectation is, compared to the June budget, that revenues are going to be higher, $4.7 billion. The key thing here is that number does not account for any of the potential impacts of the federal tax bill. So that is one of our main tasks between now and May, is to make better sense of what that's going to mean for the overall economy, what it's going to mean for the California economy, and what it's going to mean for California revenues. Obviously, there are a ton of factors that are incredibly complicated, and at this point, I don't think there's a single person who understands how that's all going to work out on a net basis. But that's one of our tasks for the next 4 months. Obviously, we had a very good December in terms of cash coming in. The controller just released her monthly report. Really, the question there is how much of that money was simply accelerated that we would normally see in April versus how much is reflecting underlying revenue growth within the California economy. Again, that's an unanswerable question at this point. We really won't have a better idea until May revision. And truly, we won't know the full effect of the federal tax bill until at least 2019 when individuals file their tax returns for the 2018 year. So we're talking about outside of towards the back end of the upcoming budget year is when we'll really have a much better sense of where our state tax revenues are going. In terms of the amount of the surplus here, this is a $6.1 billion surplus. Obviously, the major place where we put that money is into the rainy day fund at $3.5 billion on top of the required $1.5 billion under the Constitution. So a total of $5 billion. And by doing so, that's where you... There goes the pig.
I think you broke the piggy bank.
Not yet. We got to wait until that ends. So that's where we get a $5 billion increase here, fully filling the rainy day fund to $13.5 billion, which under the Constitution, if any additional money goes in there, it's available for infrastructure spending under the Constitution. So I think that hits the major highlights. Just to come back to the Children's Health Program authorization in Congress, that is one of the uncertainties we're also dealing with right now. The Congress extended it through March before we were able to, or after we were able to include it in the budget. So that action is not yet reflected. We'll catch up in May revision, and hopefully by then we'll have a better idea what their plan is for the 2018-19 fiscal year.
Michael, could you give us that little red bar for 2017-18 current fiscal year, and if that's a projection, because we're not all the way through, and also why we ended up down?
Sure.
And what's the number, actually?
So this chart is all a point in time. So it's January of every year when the governor presented the budget. So if you look back at your notes from a year ago, I think it was $1.9 billion here. But obviously things changed by May, and you're never going to adopt a budget that reflects a deficit because you're going to take corrective action to bring the budget into balance as required by the Constitution.
So that's your number from last January then. That's not a current
That is not a current.
17-18
Correct.
year.
We are projecting a surplus in the current year in terms of we will receive more money than we spend in 17-18.
And what's the exact amount of the surplus you're projecting?
6.1 is the height of this bar.
In the current year or overall?
For the budget year. So, in terms of if we did nothing, we would end the upcoming budget year with $6.1 billion extra. And so we're in 18-19. And so we're proposing to put $3.5 billion of that into the rainy day fund, keep another $2.3 billion in our operating reserve. That's the reserve where we pay for things like wildfires, earthquakes, those kind of things.
How much?
$2.3 billion. And so those are our, that's basically how we spend down the surplus by saving it in the piggy bank.
But that's money that, in theory, folks upstairs might say, hey, we'd like some of that money for either one time or ongoing. Sure.
I mean, that's the budget process. Yes, we will certainly have months of conversations about the value of our proposals.
And in your mind, is it only the 2.3 that's available for negotiating? And of course, they won't get all of it, or is it the 6.1 billion that they will say we've got that big of a, because you're not required to put the extra 3.5
No, we're clearly not required to, but of the 6.1, you have to have an operating reserve of some amount. I think this year has shown that if we didn't start the year with over $1 billion reserve, we would be in deficit because of the wildfires and all of those things. So you have to set aside some money to cover the unanticipated expenses, whether it's the Medi-Cal costs, wildfires, some other type of disaster, or you're going to end up in a deficit very quickly.
In addition to the 3.5 to the rainy day, 2.3 to the operating reserve, that's 5.8. Where's the other 300 million?
The other 300 million is laid out in the budget in terms of spending proposals. Just to highlight a few of those would be we've got spending in the corrections department, $131 million for emergency infrastructure needs. That's mold remediation, replacing some roofs, replacing public safety radios, and some high importance vehicles. We also spend additional funds in health and human services. I think you basically, if you go through the rest of the budget, the courts is a place where we spend $150 million. So between all of those spending proposals, that's the difference between the 6.1 and the amounts that we put into the reserves.
Is it all one time?
Largely one time. There's very few ongoing commitments made in this budget. There are some, but there are very few.
Michael, what's the deal with the prison roofs? I mean, these are not that old. And what's the deal with it?
You know, they are. You know, they were built in the 80s, so.
90s.
Yeah, so we're replacing the ones that are most urgently needed. But, you know, I think we think of the 80s as being not that long ago. But if it was built in the early 80s, you're talking about 25 years. Your home roof's gonna, you know, wear out by then. So.
But they almost all came in online in the 90s.
Well, I think that probably the most important thing is we spent years not repairing them or replacing them. So when you finally turn your attention to the emergency infrastructure needs, you end up with a big bill. That's the deferred maintenance number that we have in our infrastructure chapter.
Can I ask somebody, Michael may know, but one of you mentioned, you said a moment ago, of the federal money, about 2/3 is Medi-Cal.
Yeah.
Does somebody have an exact number there somewhere?
Sure.
Or tell me which page that
106 billion is the exact number. 64 billion in Medi-Cal. You need something more exact than that?
That's perfect.
That's perfect.
And Medi-Cal was 64?
64 billion. Total federal funds 106 billion.
There you go. That's good.
All right. Fill it in, post it. All right. More questions?
Has the extra pension payment, the $6 billion, is that still in the works? Has part of it been paid so far?
We paid the first quarterly payment. The second quarterly payment is about to happen, and so we're paying it basically in 4 quarterly installments.
Is no other additional boost for that for CalPERS or CalPERS?
Not over and above. We do have, as part of the Proposition 2 debt payment, part of the starting of the repaying of the $6 billion loan that we took out in the current budget. We now have plans in place that basically fully fund the CalPERS and CalSTRS systems over the next 30 years, and so we're continuing on that funding plan.
Michael, refresh my memory. What happens once we fill up the rainy day fund? Where does the excess go? I forget.
It's required by the Constitution to be spent on infrastructure.
Infrastructure.
Yeah.
As defined, what, roads, highways, or could it be like CDCR maintenance and stuff like that?
That would certainly qualify. And
Sorry.
What's that? I'm sorry.
Courts?
Courts would qualify. So we do have a court construction proposal. Roofs, deferred maintenance, all of those things would count as infrastructure.
So absent some slowdown, the cliff, the pain, either before you guys leave office, potentially, or certainly the next person, could face that issue, right, for the first time, because we would be at the 10%.
That would be a great thing for them to have to face.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
In terms of challenges, it would not be a hard one.
But just to clarify, they don't have a choice on that. I mean, that's laid out, that's prescribed.
Exactly. As soon as you get 10% of state revenues in the rainy day fund, any dollar that's required to go into the rainy day fund above that has to be spent on infrastructure.
Right.
And that's the other 50% from the 50% that has to be spent paying down like pension debt and stuff like that.
It's in addition to, it's on top of the debt side of things, yes. It's on the reserve side of Proposition 2.
Why not use more of the surplus this year to pay down pension debt? I guess it's a question for the governor, but.
I mean, given all of the uncertainties, we thought putting the money into the rainy day fund was the top priority.
Michael, the marijuana tax revenue doesn't exactly seem to be too exciting in terms of numbers. So what are you projecting on that?
We're projecting just over $600 million this first year. That's subject to as much uncertainty as the general fund revenue, I would say. We did our best based on kind of our partner states that have gone before us on this, but you know, again, it's subject to a great degree of uncertainty. And under the Proposition 64, the funds won't flow on the spending until the following year. So you basically collect the money in year 1 and spend the money in year 2.
Is there any concern that the tax rates there might be a little higher, that bringing people in from the cold? who've been involved in that industry?
I mean, the people voted for it, so,
Right.
but it's really hard to tell at this point. We're doing the best we can to get the regulatory structure in place, and then we'll see what happens.
And a quick follow-up on court funding.
Yeah.
Here on page 83, budget also commits to completing construction for the next 10 courthouses, and then lists several, one of which being Sacramento, by
Correct.
probably, I would guess, bigger than the rest combined.
They're
you
certainly big projects.
Yeah,
yes.
can you just talk a little bit more about how that money,
Sure.
I'll dig into the numbers when we get,
Yeah,
but-
so basically we have a fund that's used to fund courthouse construction that's been fully committed at this point. And so we're using $32 million of that fund this year to continue to do some planning. But then after that, we'll have to have lease revenue bonds backed by the general fund to pay for the construction of the courthouses. So it is over $1 billion for those 10 courthouses. And the Sacramento one, as you note, is
Is
the
at least
big one.
half that, about half that.
Yeah.
On community colleges,
Sorry. 460, thanks.
on community colleges, is
Yeah.
it fair to say that the funding proposal that you have for community colleges is kind of an LCFF for CCs?
Sure. I mean, I think to the extent that you consider the LCFF based on getting money where it needs to go based on lower income students, absolutely. It's also more targeted to making sure that we're putting funding based on achievement. So 25% of the money will go to those colleges that are able to produce certificates and degrees.
You expect this to be as controversial as LCFF was originally? And that took about, what, a year and a half or so?
Sure.
Hash through.
You know, there's obviously going to be some resistance to change. That's the way, the world works, that people get used to the formulas that they have. We do have a hold harmless where no one would get less money under the formula than they got this year. So that obviously helps somewhat. And I would say to any college that has concerns, the way to get more money is to produce certificates and degrees for your students. That's kind of the number one goal of the formula, is to make sure that we're serving the students properly.
And then on the preschool, you guys tried to block grant preschool funds, I think, and that didn't work.
That was,
or was it
several years ago.
Is it several years now?
It's
all blurring together.
It's been at least 3.
What are you guys trying to do? Are you trying to? I see you're expanding slots and rates, but you're not doing anything universal or anything.
Correct. So this is the 3rd year. We had a big child care preschool agreement in 2016, and this is the 3rd year of implementation of that. So we've added $1.2 billion to the system now compared to at its low. And the generally accepted number was that we had cut it $1 billion. So now we're kind of above the point where we cut, and so we're sort of continuing our commitment that we made in 2016.
And on UC and CSU, 3% increases as opposed to 4%, 5% over.
Right. We signaled that a year ago that they should expect 3%, and so we're sticking with our commitment. We want to make sure. I mean, one of the concerns they've raised in the past is that if they don't have kind of some length of time ahead of time to know how much is coming, it makes it much harder to plan. So that was why a year ago we signaled that they should plan on 3%.
But you're expecting them to keep tuition flat.
Exactly.
Is there any, is that tied to the money as a string? They have to keep it that way, or?
At this point, it's a clear message from the governor that he expects tuition to be flat. And then if it doesn't stay flat, we'll deal with that when that happens.
Is there seed money for the California Online College? I don't really see a figure in it.
It's $120 million. $100 million is one time, so sort of for the startup costs of the college, and then $20 million would be the ongoing amount to continue to operate the college.
So you expect it to cost $20 million a year going forward?
Exactly.
Anything we're missing? Something that an area there's
none of it.
175 pages here. What's the sleeper issue that's going to emerge?
You tell me.
No, you tell me.
Find it tomorrow. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.